Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in New York. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the winter of 1893, the lower wards of Manhattan were colder than usual. Snow gathered between the cobblestones of Mulberry Street, and the gas lamps gave off a dim orange halo through the fog. That winter, a new clergyman arrived at St. Matthew's Parish, a modest chapel standing in the shadow of St. Patrick's Old Cathedral. His name was Reverend Nathaniel Brooke, recently transferred from Albany after what church records described only as doctrinal disagreements. Few knew much of him. He was said to have served briefly at a mission along the Hudson, then vanished from diocesan mention for almost 2 years before resurfacing in New York. When he came to St. Matthew's, the congregation numbered fewer than 50. The church smelled of damp plaster and candle wax. Brooke was soft-spoken, tall, and moved with deliberate grace. His first sermon, on the Feast of the Epiphany, struck parishioners as unusually somber. His words lingered on death, confession, and the unrest of the flesh. Some said he spoke as though pleading with unseen company. A young altar boy later recalled that Brooke never blinked when he stared at the crucifix, as if waiting for it to respond. Within weeks, the parish began to change. Attendance improved slightly, but the air grew tense. The sacristan, Mr. Felix Moran, complained of unwholesome odors from the rectory basement and the sound of faint chanting at ungodly hours. The caretaker dismissed it as rats or drunken vagrants. Yet neighbors told constables they sometimes saw a single light moving behind the stained glass windows long after midnight. It was during this period that small notices appeared in the New York Herald. Missing, Anna Doyle, age 17, last seen near Prince Street, returning from St. Matthew's choir practice. The police received few leads. 2 weeks later, a seamstress named Lillian Grant vanished on her way to deliver vestments to the same parish. Rumors bloomed quickly in those crowded neighborhoods. Some whispered of a black mass behind the church, others spoke of a hidden confessional that led beneath the altar. The Archdiocese ignored the talk, focusing instead on rebuilding efforts and the growing prestige of St. Patrick's Old Cathedral nearby. But certain entries from the city clerk's correspondence show that an anonymous letter reached the police in March 1893. It read simply, "Look under the church where he prays alone." The handwriting was shaky, feminine. The precinct captain assigned Detective Miles Hennigan to make a discreet inspection. Hennigan visited St. Matthew's one wet evening, questioning Brooke politely. The priest, calm and smiling, granted full access. The detective found nothing unusual, except the smell. His later report, now in the municipal archives, states, "A faint odor of decay, like long-buried flowers." Parishioners began keeping distance from their pastor. Confessions dropped. Children were withdrawn from catechism. By Easter, Brooke stood almost alone at the altar, his sermons reduced to murmurs on repentance and the beauty of silence. He was no longer mentioned by name in the diocese bulletins. Only years later would anyone piece together how his name had been altered before. In all provisional license. That subtle change masked a previous reprimand for moral indiscretions unbecoming of clergy. What those indiscretions were, no document states. But an unsigned memo preserved in the Chancery hints at conduct regarding the deceased not in accordance with decorum. It was a phrase the hierarchy used sparingly, most often in cases best left unspoken. The people of Mulberry Street would remember that winter as the season the church bells seemed to ring of their own accord. Those who lived near the parish swore that sometimes, in the lull between tolls, another faint rhythm echoed underground, like a second bell answering from below. By the spring thaw of 1893, something had changed in the air around St. Matthew's. The damp stones of the rectory never quite dried, and the parish grounds smelled faintly of iron even after heavy rain. A clerk from the nearby bakery, young Peter Halloran, recalled in an affidavit decades later that he often saw Reverend Brooke standing in the churchyard before dawn, motionless for long minutes, his collar unbuttoned, eyes closed as if listening to something beneath the earth. Halloran claimed the priest muttered short phrases in Latin, none he could recognize except the words Requiem aeternam. These recollections, filed years afterward, were likely colored by gossip, but their consistency across several witnesses made them difficult to dismiss. Parishioners whispered that the priest had taken to sleeping in the crypt, a space normally reserved for records and sacramental wine. The caretaker, Moran, resigned in May after hearing what he described as a scraping, like furniture being dragged on stone. He wrote in a brief note to the diocese that he feared the father found another custodian, an elderly immigrant named Leandro Vasili, who spoke little English and kept to himself. He would later testify that Brooke forbade him from entering the basement after sunset, insisting the air below was dangerous to mortal lungs. City directories from that year list St. Matthew's as under partial renovation, a convenient explanation for shuttered side entrances and irregular services. When the vestrywoman, Miss Margaret Coyle, confronted Brooke about missing altar linens and communion vessels, he told her they were being purified. Her diary, discovered among estate papers in 1911, contains a final entry from that month. Something beneath the altar moves in the walls. He says it is the breath of saints. In mid-June, Detective Hennigan returned unannounced, driven by new reports of missing women. The body of one, identified as seamstress Lillian Grant, had been found near the East River docks. Her death was ruled accidental immersion, though the coroner noted small punctures along the jawline as if by a fine instrument. The detective questioned Brooke again, who remained calm but evasive. Records show that Hennigan requested a search warrant but was denied due to lack of evidence and ecclesiastical protection. Church property required diocesan consent. The matter would have ended there had it not been for a letter received by the Archbishop's office. It was signed only M.C., warning that the priest was keeping relics not of holy kind. The diocese sent Monsignor Raphael Donnelly, a senior cleric and quiet reformer, known to consult occasionally with St. Patrick's Old Cathedral authorities, where restoration work was underway. Donnelly's surviving notes mentioned that Brooke's quarters contained several jars sealed with wax, labeled in Latin with the names of departed parishioners. Brooke explained these as vessels containing consium, crated ashes. Donnelly reported the matter closed, yet his handwriting falters on the final line. He died suddenly 2 weeks later of what the papers called a seizure. Parish rumor insisted he'd collapsed during prayer, clutching a scrap of linen embroidered with the words, Sanguis me redimit, blood has redeemed me. It was that summer when the city suffered a series of brutal heat waves. Night air grew thick, and the small windows of St. Matthew's glowed with an unnatural hue from candlelight burning past midnight. Fishermen returning from the East River claimed the bells of the church rang at hours when no one was inside. The sexton who replaced Moran fled within days, telling a tavern keeper that he'd seen the priest carrying a long sack, dragging as if weighted. Nothing came of the report. Records fell silent for several months. Brooke continued to serve Mass to dwindling crowds, each sermon darker than the last. He spoke of the body as merely the soil from which the soul flowers, and of forgiveness, not from God, but from the quiet beneath. Those few who still attended began to notice an odor rising from the sanctuary floor, a mingling of incense and something bitterly sweet. But the church hierarchy, preoccupied with larger reforms across the city's parishes, kept its distance. It would take another disappearance, and by late September 1893, the heat had lifted, but unease clung to the narrow streets like damp cloth. Those who lived near St. Matthew's said the air around the church felt heavier after dusk, as if the fog itself refused to drift through. In the city's registers that month, a quiet note appears beside the parish's name. Reduced attendance. Structural repair pending. Yet no record exists of any construction. According to later testimony, Reverend Brooke had begun sealing off sections of the church interior. The confessional booths were boarded shut, and drapery hung across the transept, giving the sanctuary the look of a funeral parlor. Only the nave remained open, lit by a few candles and one oil lamp that flickered against the plastered saints. Parishioners recalled his voice growing distant, almost detached, as if reciting rather than preaching. "He no longer looked at us," one woman said in her affidavit to police decades later. "He looked beyond us, behind." In early October, a young organ apprentice named Samuel Franks was brought in from another parish to assist with repairs to the church's pump organ. He wrote to his cousin that week, describing his first evening there. "The floorboards hum underfoot, as though hollow. Father Brooke insists I work only when he is present. He listens, not to the pipes, but to the silence between them." That letter would be produced many years later during a municipal inquiry. 2 nights after it was sent, Samuel vanished. His tools were found neatly arranged beside the altar rail, a fresh candle still burning. The police were notified, but made only a cursory inspection, finding nothing amiss except a patch of damp stone beneath the choir loft. Their report concluded, no evidence of struggle, possible runaway. 3 days later, a janitor at the neighboring schoolhouse reported hearing sounds beneath the floor, muffled knocks, falls, owed by what he described as a faint hymn. He assumed it was echo from the church until the sound stopped abruptly mid-verse. Around this time, an article appeared in the New York Tribune referencing the peculiar mood within smaller Manhattan parishes and mentioning, without name, a clergyman of alarming reserve. Though no source was cited, the implication was clear enough that the Archdiocese quietly ordered Brooke to take a period of spiritual rest. He refused, claiming divine instruction forbade departure until the work was complete. Church officials, cautious of scandal and perhaps remembering the recent controversies surrounding St. Patrick's Old Cathedral, declined to pursue it further. That decision would prove disastrous. By early November, frost crept into the stone corridors, and the faint odor within the sanctuary turned acrid. A parish widow, Mrs. Louise Gentry, noticed a thin trickle of dark fluid seeping from beneath the altar base during morning prayer. She alerted the police again, but the constable assigned to the district recorded only discoloration due to leaking pipe. The next day, the fluid was gone. That same week, several residents of Mulberry Street reported seeing Brooke pushing a small handcart covered with cloth toward the East River before dawn. One dock worker later testified that he believed the cart held old lumber or rubbish. In December, with the year drawing to its end, the diocese finally dispatched Father Jerome Cutter to assume temporary duties at St. Matthew's. Upon arrival, Cutter found the rectory abandoned, the hearth cold, and the cellar door bolted. His statement to the church office reads, "Silence absolute, smell intolerable, no sign of the Reverend." When the lock was broken, they found a narrow stair leading into darkness, the stone wet with condensation. What lay beneath was not disclosed in any official record. But Cutter resigned the following day. When the new year of 1894 arrived, St. Matthew's Parish stood deserted except for a single caretaker appointed by the diocese to maintain appearances. The newspapers never printed the full account, but fragments survived through depositions filed years later. According to Father Jerome Cutter's final report, which was quietly archived in diocesan storage, the rectory cellar opened into an older chamber built long before the current church, possibly a remnant of pre-Civil War foundations. Inside, he described a circular space lined with shelves of glass containers, each labeled with faint Latin inscriptions: Corpus Mariae, Vox Innocentis, Sanguis Fidei. Some held dark sediment, others were empty but still sealed. In the center of the chamber stood an old baptismal font filled with blackened water, its rim etched with crude markings. Cutter noted that the air was sweet yet foul, as though incense and rot had mingled for ages. When questioned later, he said the place felt inhabited though void. The diocese removed these notes from circulation, and the surviving copy is believed to be a transcription from a clerk who secretly copied the report before it was burned. The caretaker assigned afterward was a German immigrant named Otto Grunewald. His correspondence to a friend in Brooklyn reveals further details. He wrote, "The church sleeps in its dust, yet sometimes I hear him walking. I have barred the crypt, but the locks rust quickly." Within 3 months, Grunewald vanished, his wages left uncollected. City inspectors entered the property in April and found the doors chained from the inside. No trace of human occupation remained, except a faint stain on the stairwell wall shaped like a handprint. After that, the church was officially decommissioned. Local children broke its windows for sport, and rumors grew. Some said the bells still rang on the anniversary of the disappearances. Others swore that under certain tides, a single candle could be seen flickering through the upper window, though the glass was long shattered. The Catholic authorities quietly dissolved St. Matthew's Parish, folding its territory into neighboring districts under new clergy. Yet files preserved in the Archdiocesan ledger reveal continued expenditures labeled custodial oversight. In 1896, a historian named Dr. Amos Whitaker, researching the city's forgotten churches, gained temporary access. His journal, now kept at Columbia's Rare Archives, provides the most detailed surviving description. He wrote, "The building retains a stillness unnatural to abandonment. Dust lies evenly, as if undisturbed by air. The altar bears scorch marks beneath its cloth, and the smell of sweet decay persists though the floorboards are dry." Whitaker also mentioned discovering a set of torn sermons in Brooke's handwriting, each beginning with the same line, "The flesh is the chalice of truth, and truth must be tasted to be known." Whitaker speculated that Brooke suffered from religious mania bordering on necrophilic obsession, a diagnosis echoed decades later by criminologists reviewing unsolved disappearances from that period. The authorities, eager to protect the church's public image, ignored his findings. By the turn of the century, St. Matthew's was demolished, its stones sold for reuse in housing projects near Canal Street. The ground where it stood was left vacant until 1908, when a small warehouse was built on the site. Workers there claimed that every winter, frost formed in the pattern of a cross on the north wall, regardless of the weather. Old residents warned newcomers not to linger after dark, especially when the bells from St. Patrick's Old Cathedral rang faintly through the fog. They said the sound seemed to call from below. By 1897, the name Reverend Nathaniel Brooke had become a whisper few dared repeat. Officially, he was missing, presumed deceased, yet no body, no grave, no clerical record closed his file. The diocesan registry listed only one notation in the margin beside his name, status nullus responsus, meaning no replies. It was around this time that residents of the Bowery began telling tales of a silent man in priest garb wandering near the East River piers at night. Fishermen swore they'd seen him leaning over the water, as if whispering to his own reflection. Police patrols dismissed these as drunkards' fancies, but one constable, Charles Reardon, filed a brief report in February 1897, noting an individual resembling Reverend N. Brooke, formerly of St. Matthew's, observed near Pier 34, carrying a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Riordan approached, but the man turned and disappeared into the fog. The constable followed the sound of footsteps until they ended abruptly beside an open sewer grate. He found no trace but wrote, "Air foul, like charnel damp." That report was never followed up. In that same year, dock workers discovered several small boxes washed ashore downstream, each containing fragments of bone and soaked linen tied with rosary string. No attempt was made to identify them. The coroner labeled them medical refuse. But a clerk from the Public Health Office, John Cafferty, later claimed in his memoir that one of the linen scraps bore faint embroidery reading SM, the initials once seen on vestments from St. Matthew's Parish. When he brought it to his supervisor, he was told curtly to destroy it. He didn't. He kept it in a drawer until his death in 1921, when his widow turned it over to a local historian. The scrap disintegrated before any proper analysis could be made. Around this same period, a few of Brooke's earlier parishioners were interviewed by a journalist from The Sun. None would speak openly, but one widow allowed a single remark to be quoted. "He promised we would not be forgotten, and now he keeps that promise." The article ran only once, buried among crime reports. By 1898, whispers of his reappearance spread north to Yonkers and Poughkeepsie. A farmer claimed to have given shelter to a weary clergyman, who spoke of unfinished penance and refused to sleep indoors. The man left before dawn, taking nothing but a candle and a small wooden box. No further trace was found. Though Brooke's trail grew faint, his legend deepened. In early 1900, a group of theology students from Fordham visited the ruins of St. Matthew's site, curious about the stories. One of them, writing later to a professor, described finding fragments of stained glass with dark red residue clinging to their edges. Another mentioned that the earth beneath the demolished altar was unusually soft, though the surrounding ground had hardened with frost. These details might have meant nothing if not for what followed. In March of that year, the warehouse constructed on the former Parish lot suffered a partial collapse. No casualties were reported, but workers unearthed a shallow cavity beneath the foundation lined with bricks from the old church walls. Inside lay a rusted crucifix and the remains of a small notebook, its pages fused by moisture. On the surviving cover, faded yet legible, was written, "Ad te veni post noctem. I come to thee after the night." The relics were turned over to the city archives, then vanished within weeks. An internal memo dated April 2, 1900, recorded them as misplaced in transfer. Whether this was coincidence or quiet removal remains unknown. The incident rekindled fear among locals, and once again stories circulated, of soft hymns heard near the site on stormy nights, of children waking to the scent of myrrh without candles burning. Those who passed the lot after midnight often spoke of seeing the outline of a man head. By 1901, the story of the vanished priest had grown into something half legend, half warning, told in boarding houses and waterfront taverns. Those who remembered the old St. Matthew's claimed that Reverend Brooke's shadow still moved within the fog whenever church bells rang over the East River. The diocesan records for that year include one curious entry marked "Confidential," correspondence between Bishop Alphonse Duval and his assistant referring to a persistent case of misplaced relics connected to the former Mulberry Parish. The document was unsigned, but the handwriting matched earlier clerical notes on Brooke. Duval's private papers, later catalogued in the 1920s, make indirect mention of a brother who mistook sanctity for flesh. No name appears, yet the phrasing leaves little doubt whom he meant. Around that time, an investigator from the municipal coroner's office, Dr. Henry Lambert, began reviewing unsolved disappearances along the East River dating from 1892 to 1897. His unpublished notes describe similarities in the recovered remains: small bones carefully stripped of flesh, incisions consistent with post-mortem manipulation, and traces of wax and incense. Lambert suggested a link to ritualistic preservation, possibly ecclesiastical in origin. When he presented his findings, his department quietly reassigned him. 2 months later, he left for Baltimore and never returned to public service. Meanwhile, old parishioners were dying out, their memories fading into rumor. But new workers who occupied the warehouse, built atop the former church, began complaining of headaches and nausea. Several claimed that at certain hours, the same hours Brooke once conducted Mass, the building's floor vibrated faintly, like distant organ notes. One night watchman, Patrick Tierney, wrote in his logbook that he heard soft weeping from beneath the boards, though the basement had been sealed for years. When he tore up a section of the flooring out of curiosity, he found only dry soil and fragments of broken tile. He quit the next morning. Within weeks, 2 other employees fell ill with fever and blisters along their throats. The company's foreman blamed chemical fumes from nearby tanneries, but a physician noted no sign of poisoning. The workers refused to return at night, and by autumn the warehouse closed temporarily for structural inspection. In the same period, a small article appeared in the New York Times under the heading "Mysterious Complaints in Canal Street Depot." It mentioned the odd sickness, the abandoned floors, and briefly recalled the property's earlier history as a church long demolished after scandal. The paper printed no names, but the mention of a priest whose sermons were said to hush even the bells was enough to reignite whispers in the neighborhood. Old men sitting outside tenement doors told newcomers to avoid the street after sunset. Children were warned never to touch the stone cross embedded in the wall of the warehouse's foundation, said to have been salvaged from St. Matthew's altar. Yet some did. Years later, a retired dockhand named Robert Mayfield told interviewers that as a boy he placed his palm on that cross and felt a vibration, like a heartbeat slow and steady. He was not the only one. Visitors to the site throughout the early 1900s reported the same sensation, a warmth beneath the stone, pulsing faintly, gone as soon as they pulled away. Scientists attributed it to the thermal expansion of buried pipes. But among the locals, it was said the priest had been entombed alive beneath the rubble, still seeking absolution from whatever power he had once invoked. Whether myth or memory, the name Reverend Brooke persisted, whispered by night guards and... By 1903, the lot once holding St. Matthew's had become a place of quiet avoidance. The warehouse company officially relocated, citing insurance concerns, yet among workers the reason was simpler. They believed the building was cursed. A few tenements nearby remained occupied, and their residents often spoke of low murmurs drifting through the fog in early morning hours, like a prayer repeated by someone underground. One night in March, a patrolman recorded in his log that he'd heard church bells at precisely 2:17 a.m. He checked with St. Patrick's Old Cathedral, which confirmed no service or mechanical tolling had occurred. The echo, he wrote, sounded nearer, as if within the earth. That report, though brief, survives in the police archives and marks the last official mention of the St. Matthew's site for several years. The following summer, a small fire broke out in a neighboring bakery, and when firefighters arrived, they discovered the warehouse doors ajar, though the building had stood vacant for months. Inside, dust and cobwebs covered everything except a clear path leading toward the center where the altar once stood. There, beneath a thin layer of ash, lay a single candle stub still upright, its wick unburned. The fire chief, in a private statement later cited by historians, wrote that no drafts or footprints explained the cleared passage. It was as though something unseen moved through, pushing the dust aside, he noted. Shortly after, the warehouse was demolished. City officials decided to pave the land and extend a new alleyway for delivery carts. During excavation, laborers unearthed fragments of iron bars and wood arranged like the remains of a small enclosure. One worker, James O'Leary, later told a reporter from the Evening Post that among the debris he saw a rosary twisted into the shape of a figure 8. When he tried to retrieve it, it crumbled into powder. That night, O'Leary claimed he dreamed of a voice whispering his name in Latin. 2 weeks later, he fell ill and left the city. No trace of him appears after that year. Around the same period, archivists rediscovered a damaged folio in the Archdiocese basement referencing transference of sacramental materials from the Mulberry Parish case. It was unsigned, but dated 1895, and mentioned sealed containers requiring burial in sanctified ground. Where they were reburied was never recorded. The note carried a marginal remark in a different hand. Sanguine vinculum manet, the bond of blood remains. In 1904, theological scholars reviewing those papers dismissed them as misfiled, perhaps relating to epidemic-era burials. Yet one junior cleric, Father Augustine Hale, later wrote that reading the documents left him physically ill. He described an oppressive odor emanating from the parchment itself, like incense mixed with mold. Within the year, Hale left the order and entered a sanitarium in Yonkers. The institution's medical log recorded his final words to the attending nurse. He still prays beneath the stones. For the rest of that decade, the site lay empty, overgrown with weeds and littered with bricks from earlier demolitions. Local children turned it into a makeshift playground by day, but none would venture near after dusk. The few who did claimed to hear faint organ notes rising from below the ground, though no instrument remained. Older residents said the melody matched the hymn Reverend Brooke once sang during his final Mass, O Salutaris Hostia, the plea for deliverance. Whether coincidence or not, those who heard it described a rhythm too precise for wind. Each note lingered. By 1906, New York had already forgotten most of its 19th century scandals, but the parish lot at Mulberry and Prince remained stubbornly unclaimed. Developers who inspected it complained of inexplicable moisture rising from the soil even in midsummer, and construction crews refused to dig deeper than a few feet. When pressed, they said the ground breathed. A city surveyor named Edwin Latimer documented the phenomenon, noting that the air temperature just above the surface was several degrees warmer than the surrounding street. His assistant reported a low vibration detectable through the metal legs of their instrument. The city dismissed the findings as sewer venting, but Latimer, fascinated, returned alone at night to take further readings. He never submitted another report. His belongings were later found on the site. His lamp shattered, his notebook missing its final pages. The press briefly mentioned his disappearance before turning to other news. A few weeks later, strange columns of mist began to rise from the ground after rainstorms. Residents described them as pale and slow-moving, shaped vaguely like figures kneeling in prayer. Newspapers blamed gas leaks. Police roped off the area for months, though no danger was proven. During that same year, the Archdiocese underwent administrative changes. Old case files were reviewed, and once again the name Nathaniel Brooke surfaced. An internal memorandum suggested relocating any remaining property of the defunct parish to church vaults upstate. Among these were said to be liturgical materials of uncertain sanctity. A junior archivist named Ellen Barron was tasked with cataloging them. Her private journal, later found in a convent library, mentions crates labeled simply Mulberry. She wrote, "I dared to open one. The smell overcame me. Within lay vessels sealed with crimson wax, and upon the glass were words screened, etched by hand, Vita post carnem." She closed it immediately and requested reassignment. A month later she fell ill with fever and delirium, insisting she could hear chanting from the jars. She died within the year, and the crates vanished from record soon after. In the neighborhood, time dulled memory but not rumor. The new tenants of nearby buildings spoke of seeing a robed figure drifting through the fog along the alley, never leaving footprints. A letter from a night watchman, preserved in police evidence files, describes watching the figure pause at the paved cross where the altar once stood, kneel, and then sink slowly into the ground like a reflection fading. The officer who collected the statement wrote in the margin, "Witness sober, shaken, not prone to fancy." Yet nothing further was done. In that same year, workers repairing gas lines beneath the street discovered a narrow brick shaft descending deeper than the city's mapped foundations. It ended abruptly in collapsed stone and standing water. When they measured the depth, it matched precisely the height of St. Matthew's nave as recorded in church blueprints, a hollow beneath the earth mirroring the vanished church above. The site was finally declared unstable and filled with gravel. By year's end, a small tenement was built there, but residents complained of sleeplessness, strange knocking within the walls, and the persistent odor of candle wax, though none were lit. One tenant, Mrs. Edna Cook, told a visiting journalist she sometimes woke to find faint soot on her hands and a smear of red dust along her window ledge. "It's like someone brushed by in the dark," she said, "someone still wearing robes." The article was never published. The journalist died suddenly of a stroke before submitting his copy. The notes found in his type. By 1908, the Mulberry tenement had gained a reputation that no landlord could erase. Families moved in and out within weeks, some leaving furniture behind as if eager to flee before nightfall. The building superintendent, a stoic Italian named Marco Bellini, kept meticulous records of each vacancy. In his log, now stored in municipal archives, he noted repeated complaints: smell of damp earth from floor, whispers near water pipes, and footsteps pacing ceiling though top floor empty. At first he believed it was rats or settling timber, until one night he entered the basement to inspect the plumbing and found water seeping from between bricks that had not been there the week before. The moisture smelled faintly of incense. Bellini bricked the gap shut himself. Yet the next morning it had reopened, edges clean, mortar fresh as if newly laid from within. He never returned to that basement again. Around this time, the parish authorities in the city received an unsigned envelope containing a small page of parchment torn from an old missal. On it was scrawled the words, Missa in tenebris, Mass in darkness, and beneath, in a different hand, He serves still. The handwriting was shaky, aged. The letter's origin was traced to a postal box in Yonkers, though no sender was identified. Records show that a former priest, Father Jerome Cutter, had been residing in a sanitarium near there since 1895. When questioned by diocesan representatives, the institution confirmed Cutter had died a week before the letter was mailed. His personal belongings were already destroyed. The nuns who attended him reported his final nights were spent in prayer, whispering Latin phrases none could understand, ending always with, "Forgive him, for he walks." The tenement's new occupants began noticing lights under the floorboards, flickers that moved like lanterns far below. Children claimed to hear, singing through the drains, soft and slow, the same few lines repeated, O salutaris hostia. When parents dismissed these tales, the children grew feverish, waking with soil under their fingernails. A local doctor advised fumigation, but nothing changed. Soon after, Bellini ordered the basement sealed permanently. He hired laborers to pour concrete over the old brickwork. Yet according to later testimony from one of those workers, a man named Charles Fenwick, they never completed the job. He told reporters decades later, the cement would not hold. It set like jelly, then cracked by morning, and there was heat under the ground. Heat in winter. In his final statement before leaving the city, Fenwick added, "Something breathes down there." During this period, scholars studying ecclesiastical history at Fordham revisited forgotten church files, among them the case of St. Matthew's. One professor, Dr. William Corcoran, found references to a series of sealed jars removed from the parish in 1894. Cross-checking shipment ledgers, he discovered that several crates addressed to the diocesan cemetery had never arrived. Their manifests listed contents as ashes, relics, devotional specimens. Corcoran wrote a short article about the discrepancy for a theological journal, but before publication he withdrew it, writing privately to a colleague that he feared touching the old wound. The letter ends with a single line underlined twice. They were never ashes. By the close of 1908, the city condemned the Mulberry tenement, citing substructure instability. Residents were relocated, the building boarded up, and for the first time in over a decade, the lot lay silent again. But a final entry in Bellini's ledger, dated December 29th, stands alone on the page. At dawn I heard the bells, 6 chimes, 1 pause, then 3, same as before. No church in the district reported ringing at hour, and none nearby used that pattern. When questioned, by 1910 the condemned lot stood fenced and forgotten, an island of rubble between new brick warehouses and the widening city streets. Snow drifted there in winter, and children dared each other to toss stones over the fence, but no one ever retrieved them. The Department of Buildings listed the address simply as unsafe structure, no permit. Yet one municipal inspector, Samuel Griggs, made notes in his ledger after a site visit in February. He wrote that when he stepped onto the frozen ground, he felt a hollow echo, as if boards lay beneath the dirt. He struck the surface with his boot and heard a dull reverberation. A second entry, dated a week later, records that the soil had sunk several inches overnight in a neat oval depression. When Griggs returned with another officer, the depression had filled with water, though the weather remained dry. The officer refused to step closer, remarking that it smelled of candles gone cold. After that, the city halted further inspection. The following spring, a journalist for the New York Evening Telegram, Leonard Miles, began researching old church scandals for a feature on the city's vanished parishes. His notebooks, discovered decades later, include sketches of the St. Matthew's site and interviews with aging residents. One old seamstress, identified only as Mrs. Caro, told him, "The priest wasn't taken away. He went downward. He built another church below ours." Miles dismissed it as superstition until a laborer repairing a gas main nearby uncovered a fragment of carved stone bearing part of an inscription. Matt, and what appeared to be fingernail scratches across its surface. Miles photographed the piece and sent it to a local historian, but before the image could be published, the glass plate shattered mysteriously in storage. Miles himself fell ill shortly afterward. His last letter to his editor claimed he heard Faina's organ notes from beneath his boarding-house room whenever it rained. He wrote, "It plays the same refrain, an offertory without end." He died of pneumonia within a month. In church circles, the matter resurfaced briefly that same year, when a young priest named Father Declan Reeves requested access to archived materials concerning Reverend Brooke. Reeves was researching demonic possession in clerical history and believed the case a moral allegory. But after reading the sealed files, he suffered what his peers described as a crisis of faith. He left the seminary, retreating to rural Pennsylvania, where he spent the rest of his life in silence. His single surviving note from that period, preserved in a monastery library, reads, "The relics were not his victims, they were his congregation." During the following years, construction crews avoided the lot, claiming their tools rusted overnight. City plans to repurpose the land stalled indefinitely. Meanwhile, residents in adjacent buildings reported seeing faint orange light flickering through gaps in the fence at night, as though a lamp burned underground. Police patrols sent to investigate found nothing except warm air rising from cracks in the pavement. One officer recorded in his report, "No source found. Temperature below ground higher than surface by several degrees." In 1912, a minor earthquake shook parts of lower Manhattan. Though damage was minimal, the only structure affected in Mulberry Street was the fenced ruin. Witnesses described a loud cracking sound and a plume of dust rising straight upward, like smoke from a censer. When it cleared, a new fissure split the ground from curb to curb, narrow but deep. Children later dropped stones into it and claimed to hear faint echoes, not of stone on stone, but something softer, like breath. City workers filled it with gravel, but within days the crack reopened. Officials paved it over at last, sealing it beneath new asphalt. Yet even decades later, old residents swore that whenever heavy facing east, hands folded as if still offering a prayer that had never been heard. By 1913, the Mulberry Street site had become a dead spot on city maps, a place listed but rarely visited. Urban progress had surrounded it, trolley lines, telegraph poles, new storefronts, but nothing thrived directly over the old parish ground. The asphalt remained cracked year-round despite repairs, as if the earth beneath resisted closure. Those who lived nearby claimed that every Good Friday the street grew unnaturally quiet, carriages muffled, dogs refusing to bark. Around this time, a new building inspector named Harold Crane was assigned to survey older lots scheduled for redevelopment. His field notes, later obtained by researchers, show that he approached the Mulberry address on April 17, 1913. He recorded, "Surface warm to the touch, air dense, smell, faintly floral, not unpleasant but foreign." He measured no gas leaks, yet his companion, a surveyor named Owen Brady, refused to step closer after hearing what he described as a sighing under the stones. Crane laughed it off, finished his sketches, and left. 2 days later, he failed to report to the office. When officials visited his apartment, they found his notebook open to a single line written hastily. "The foundation sings." His body was never found. In that same year, a retired nun from the original St. Matthew's Parish, Sister Agnes Mary, wrote a letter to the Archdiocese from her infirmary bed in Jersey City. Her letter survives in faded ink. "Forgive me for remembering. The man you called Brooke came often to confession, but he confessed in reverse. He took my silence as his absolution. We were told never to record his penance." She died a week after sending it, and the diocese sealed her papers permanently. Only later did a clerk transcribe that final line. Some historians suggest it confirms Brooke's pattern of self-order, inid ritual, inverting liturgy to his own design. During the fall of 1913, construction began again near the block as part of an expansion for trolley maintenance sheds. Workers struck an old stone arch buried several feet down, precisely where records place St. Matthew's nave. Beneath it, they discovered a pocket of dry air and fragments of charred timber. The foreman halted work when one laborer unearthed what looked like a length of candle wrapped in decayed cloth. He described it as soft, though it hadn't melted. A diocesan representative arrived, collected the items, and left without comment. That same night, the excavation filled with water rising from an unseen source, flooding the trench entirely by morning. The project was abandoned once again. Meanwhile, reports spread among trolley operators that the rails nearest the site produced a low hum when trains passed, distinct from normal vibration. Passengers occasionally claimed to hear faint singing beneath the noise of wheels. Letters to the city's transit bureau dismissed such stories as coincidence, yet internal maintenance logs refer to repeated electrical interference localized to Mulberry vicinity. A young technician who inspected the circuit later told friends he felt a pulse through the rail as though the metal itself breathed once. He left the job shortly thereafter. That winter, when heavy snow fell, witnesses swore that no matter how thick the drifts grew, the center of that block never held frost. Steam rose constantly, the asphalt damp even in freezing temperatures, giving the impression of something alive under the surface. One journalist poetically called it the city's heartbeat. By the winter of 1914, Mulberry Street had changed again, yet the cursed block resisted progress as always. The city's energy pulsed around it, streetcars clattering, vendors shouting, tenement windows glowing with gaslight. But within that single fenced parcel, silence remained absolute. Even rats avoided it. When wind passed between the nearby buildings, the sound would suddenly cut off upon reaching that stretch of pavement, as if swallowed by the ground. In February, a new municipal project proposed laying telegraph conduits beneath the road. When the crew began digging, their picks struck something hollow. The men paused, listening. Beneath the scrape of metal came a faint echo, not of stone, but of something smoother, curved. The foreman, reluctant but curious, ordered the pit widened. Beneath 2 feet of asphalt and soil, they uncovered an arched surface of white material, plaster or marble, engraved faintly with Latin script. Only one phrase was legible: Sub terra pax, peace beneath the earth. Before they could continue, a heavy vibration shuddered through the trench, knocking tools from hands. The sound lasted only seconds, but all present described it the same: a deep, hollow breath. The pit collapsed soon after, filling with black water. The foreman sealed it at once, reporting only unstable substrate. No further excavation was attempted. Yet one worker, a man named Joseph Leto, kept a small fragment of the carved surface. In his later affidavit, he described it as cold even near the fire. He wrapped it in cloth and stored it at home. Within weeks, his family complained of illness, fevers, nightmares, an odor of wax. He threw the fragment into the East River. The symptoms ceased, but he never slept soundly again. His confession to a priest years later, recorded in parish notes, concluded with his whispered plea: "I should not have touched what was meant to res." Meanwhile, whispers of Brooke's legend found their way into academic circles once more. A young historian, Clara Winthrop, researching religious architecture, stumbled upon an 1894 newspaper clipping referencing the Mulberry priest. She sought access to diocesan archives, but was denied. Undeterred, she interviewed elderly parishioners in Lower Manhattan. Most refused to speak, but one widow, Mrs. O'Shaughnessy, told her, "He promised the dead would listen if we did." Winthrop later summarized her findings in a private manuscript, noting, "The parish functioned as a mirror, the church above and its twin below, ritual inverted, heaven beneath the ground." She sent the draft to a colleague, but never published it. The document vanished with her papers during the influenza outbreak of 1918. In April 1914, tremors again shook the district. No other part of the city felt them. Residents described a low moan that seemed to rise from the pavement itself. A lamplighter named Henry Voss reported seeing the asphalt lift slightly, as if something pressed from underneath. No structural damage followed, but several witnesses recalled the same odor afterward, a blend of incense and seawater. The event was quickly forgotten amid wartime headlines, yet old records suggest city engineers returned quietly that summer to reinforce the foundation. Their report, buried in the municipal archive, notes only: no cavity found, subsoil unusually warm. The priest's name appeared one final time that year in a marginal annotation on a diocesan ledger: Brooke, unresolved, leave sealed. The handwriting differed from earlier clerks, suggesting the record had been reopened and closed again. What prompted that brief resurgence remains unknown. But for those who lived nearby, the year ended as it always had: fog rolling in from the harbor, bells faint in the distance, and beneath their feet. By 1916, the city above ground was alive with wartime industry, yet the hollow block on Mulberry still resisted every attempt to reclaim it. Children passing by called it the Quiet Street, a name their parents discouraged but never denied. No birds perched on the lampposts there, no snow lingered more than a few minutes. That spring, an electrical crew laying new streetlights encountered unusual resistance when drilling into the pavement. Their auger struck what felt like metal, but when withdrawn, the tip was coated not with filings, but a thin layer of reddish dust that smelled faintly sweet. The foreman halted work, ordering a shift to another section. Within a week, 2 of his men fell sick with fatigue and skin blisters. Their doctor described it as chemical exposure, yet no contaminant was identified. Meanwhile, office clerks in nearby buildings began to report a strange phenomenon: ink refusing to dry on their ledgers, remaining tacky for hours as if the air carried moisture unseen. One clerk, idly testing it, wrote the words Ave Maria across a blank margin. Within seconds, the ink turned dark crimson and spread outward like veins. The paper was burned immediately. No one spoke of it again. The story might have ended there, lost beneath the city's endless reconstruction, if not for a visiting scholar from Boston, Dr. Nathan Cole, who came in October to survey New York's ecclesiastical ruins. He had previously studied the archives of St. Patrick's Old Cathedral and was familiar with the legend of Brooke, whose parish once stood only blocks away. Cole's surviving field journal, preserved at the New York Historical Society, records his impressions. The site breathes, literally. When I kneel to measure the incline, I feel warmth against my palm. It hums faintly, resonant, like a pipe organ deep underwater. On his second visit, he noted hearing a single bell tone, impossible to place in direction or distance. His handwriting trails off mid-sentence. It answers when I... The rest of the page is smeared. He left New York the following week, reportedly in poor health, and died en route home. The conductor who found his belongings claimed his hands were stained with soot that smelled of candle smoke. As the war overseas grew bloodier, few paid attention to local oddities. Yet during those years, parish investigators quietly revisited unresolved cases. In an internal memo from 1917, the Archdiocese recorded persistent rumors of unsanctioned gatherings near the old Mulberry grounds, adding that individuals have been observed kneeling at night, facing east. The memo concludes with, "No official clergy assigned to that district. Source of influence unknown." A watch patrol was sent, returning with little to report except a feeling of unease and auditory confusion, distant chanting though no crowd visible. Around the same time, a night nurse from a nearby hospital wrote in her diary that she often saw a priest in old vestments walking along the alley opposite the ward windows. She described him as tall, thin, and silent, his head bowed, vanishing whenever she blinked. When she finally mentioned it to a patient, the patient replied, "You've seen Father Brooke. He's still saying Mass." The nurse later resigned, citing exhaustion. The next year, the hospital expanded its basement morgue, requiring excavation that extended near the edge of the condemned block. Workers found fragments of carved stone and what looked like the top of a broken chalice embedded in clay. When lifted, it disintegrated, releasing a gust of warm air that smelled briefly of roses. Witnesses described hearing, for just a second, the echo of organ pipes, The foreman dismissed it as pressure release from buried gas. Still, the men refused to continue digging. The site was resealed, and the hospital extended its foundation elsewhere. For the rest of that year, the melody was always the same, slow, solemn, and impossibly low, as if rising through the floorboards from a choir buried alive. By 1918, the city reeled under the weight of influenza, its streets quieter than anyone could remember. Coffins filled the docks, churches overflowed, and the few priests who remained upright worked day and night, delivering last rites. Amid the chaos, the Mulberry lot re-emerged briefly in municipal memory. The Red Cross requisitioned vacant spaces for temporary wards, and a proposal surfaced to clear the fenced block for field tents. The approval was swift, but when the first volunteer crew arrived, they refused to enter. The ground was soft despite the frost, the air warm with the odor of old wax and iron. Their captain ordered them forward. One shovel thrust revealed not earth, but a layer of ash. Within minutes, they uncovered scorched stone, and what seemed to be melted glass fused into spiral shapes. The team withdrew, reporting contaminated soil, possible chemical residue. The site was immediately struck from the relief map. Nothing further was said publicly, though an internal Red Cross memo filed weeks later mentioned a peculiar emission of gas accompanied by rhythmic vibration. The memo was never followed up. Too many were dying elsewhere. That winter, a retired constable named James Reardon, son of the same officer who once pursued Reverend Brooke near the East River, wrote to a local newspaper claiming his father's old journals connected the priest's disappearance to earlier river findings. Small boxes containing relics that were never bones alone. The editor dismissed the letter as delirium, but Riordan's note carried a haunting detail. He said the city buried the truth beneath a church that had no name. The paper refused to print it. Only the typed draft survived, later found in the editor's estate papers in the 1940s. In Marxas, the frost broke early. Residents near the old block complained of an odor like candles burned in closed air. That same week, tremors struck the district again, unnoticed by most except the hospital across the street. Nurses on the night shift recorded glass vials vibrating on shelves and the electric lamps dimming for several seconds. One nurse, a veteran of the earlier years, remarked that it felt as if someone exhaled beneath the floor. Days later, the hospital chaplain reported the sudden reappearance of an antique crucifix that had been missing since 1895. It lay neatly on the chapel altar at dawn, dustless, its brass warm to the touch. The chaplain, thinking it a prank, locked it away. But that night, the chapel door was found open, the crucifix gone again. A guard swore he'd heard distant bells just before midnight, 6 chimes, 1 pause, then 3. The pattern matched the final entry from Superintendent Bellini's ledger a decade earlier. The coincidence was not noticed until years later, when a historian compared the two accounts. No bells in the vicinity used that sequence. The city blamed tremors from passing trains, yet there were none scheduled at that hour. As the influenza waned, survivors returned to rebuild, but no one petitioned to reopen the Mulberry parcel. It remained fenced, barren, and faintly steaming during rainfall. A new generation, unaware of its past, treated it as an odd patch of wasted land. Children called it the warm corner. They said on certain nights they could hear a voice humming from below, sometimes Latin, sometimes only a low tone without words. One boy described it best, years later, in an oral history. By 1920, the city had resumed its pulse, but the Mulberry block remained an unhealed scar among the renewed streets. Progress moved around it like water around stone. Street vendors avoided setting stalls near the fence, claiming the ground ruined produce with a church smell, a mixture of dust, incense, and damp cloth. In that same year, the diocese undertook a quiet audit of unsolved parish closures for record consolidation. One archivist, Father Leonard Harrow, discovered the thin folder marked St. Matthew's, 1893 to 1895. Inside were a few brittle pages, attendance records, fragments of sermons, and a single note in another hand reading, Reverend Nathaniel Brooke, status unresolved, materials sealed. Tucked between the sheets was a lock of hair bound with red thread. Harrow brought it to his superior, who ordered it reinterred at Calvary Cemetery under anonymous rites. The priest obeyed, but that night he awoke to the sound of distant bells. His diary records 9 chimes and a pause, then a faint knock at his window, though his room stood 3 stories high. The next morning, he sealed the folder and never spoke of it again. Elsewhere in the neighborhood, construction began on a new warehouse that would border the condemned parcel. The project engineer, Charles Donnellan, insisted on a fresh foundation rather than reusing the old fill. When excavation started, workers struck a void roughly 5 feet below the surface. The space was perfectly square, lined with blackened stone. In the center stood a single iron ring bolted into concrete. Nothing else. Donnellan, confused, ordered measurements which matched exactly the interior width of St. Matthew's original chancel. The find was noted briefly in the site log, then covered again by city inspectors who feared collapse. That evening, the crew foreman swore he heard a sound rising from the filled pit, a slow, steady beating, like a drum underwater. He quit the next morning. No other worker would take his place. For the first time in decades, a journalist revisited the case. Writing for The Sun, reporter Andrew Marwick sought to chronicle New York's lost parishes. His draft, discovered in his posthumous papers, contained interviews with elderly residents who still remembered the strange priest. One woman, nearly blind, recalled his voice. Soft as sleep, and always saying the same thing, peace beneath the earth. Marwick traced the phrase to Church Latin and found the corresponding epitaph in old cemetery records dated 1894, listed without burial site. He speculated that Brooke's followers, if any survived, had used those words as a secret litany. Before Marwick could publish, he vanished during a stormy night in October, last seen heading toward the Mulberry site carrying a notebook and lantern. His umbrella and coat were found near the fence the next morning, both dry despite heavy rain. The article never ran. During that same year, engineers conducting underground telegraph maintenance reported distorted harmonics in nearby cables, faint low tones resembling organ music. Their instruments registered the interference only when passing beneath the condemned block. The anomaly ceased after midnight, returning precisely at dawn for several days before fading. The city dismissed it as electrical resonance, but the technicians refused to enter the tunnel again. One wrote anonymously to a local paper, "There is a voice under New York, patient and slow. It does not stop." Decades later, sound engineers reviewing the archived recordings confirmed a repeating pattern at low frequency, 6 beats, a pause, 3, matching once again the bells described by Bellini, the chaplain, and others before them. Whatever remained buried at Mulberry seemed to keep time, indifferent to years. By 1922, Mulberry Street had transformed into a corridor of factories and lodging houses, yet the fenced parcel persisted, unclaimed, a square of stubborn emptiness amid industry. It drew the curiosity of only a few, the city's surveyors, amateur historians, and one young archivist named Clara DeWitt. DeWitt had been cataloging forgotten parish documents for the diocesan library when she encountered references to the Brooke materials, still marked restricted. Despite warnings, she sought permission to inspect them, arguing they might hold genealogical value. Permission was quietly granted. Her later letters, preserved by family, describe what she saw. Brittle pages stained dark, sermons written in a trembling hand, and sketches of subterranean arches mirroring the church above. The final page bore one phrase repeated until the ink tore through the parchment. Sub terra pax. She wrote, "The words seem less a prayer than an instruction." Soon afterward, DeWitt began visiting the Mulberry lot each evening, sitting outside the fence to sketch. Residents noted her presence, but said she never spoke. After 2 weeks, she vanished. Her notebook was found beneath a lamppost, pages blank except for one faint imprint on the final sheet. "Forgive him, for he walks." The handwriting matched earlier samples from parish archives. No one could explain how she had copied what she was forbidden to read. While her disappearance faded quickly from headlines, a renewed sense of dread returned to the district. Factory workers claimed to hear humming through the ground whenever their heavy presses ran, an undertone that matched no machine. It rose only when the presses stopped, continuing several seconds after silence. The sound, some said, resembled voices chanting from below. In August, a collapse occurred in a storage tunnel near the site, killing 2 men. When rescuers dug through the debris, they found the bodies unharmed but covered in fine white dust that shimmered faintly like powdered glass. The coroner's report described the substance as composition unknown, odor of frankincense. Within days, the material dissolved, leaving no residue. The following winter, rumors spread among parish elders that the diocese intended at last to exorcise the land formally. A notice in the Catholic record mentioned a private rite of purification conducted by senior clergy, but no details were printed. Witnesses later said they saw 6 priests and 1 bishop enter the fenced lot before dawn carrying candles and a censer. No one spoke as they worked. The ceremony lasted less than an hour. When they left, the air above the block shimmered with heat, though the temperature was below freezing. The priests refused interviews, and within weeks, all references to the rite were withdrawn from parish bulletins. Only 1 private note survived, written by an assistant cleric to a friend. It did not end. It only agreed to sleep. Afterward, construction crews paved the ground completely, extending the neighboring factory across part of the old foundation. For a time, the district seemed calmer, the air lighter, the rumors fading. Yet workers inside the new factory began reporting an odd occurrence. The floorboards of the lowest level would tremble faintly every Friday before dawn. Clocks would stop for exactly 9 seconds, then resume. The factory manager, reviewing maintenance logs, noticed the pattern corresponded precisely with the anniversaries of each major incident recorded on that site: 1893, 1897, 1908, 1914. He dismissed it publicly, but wrote privately, "Something beneath remembers its hours." And in a city that no longer looked back, that faint heartbeat beneath Mulberry Street. By 1925, New York's skyline had climbed skyward, yet beneath its brilliance, the ground on Mulberry Street still pulsed with a secret no steel or progress could bury. The old fence had long vanished, replaced by a brick loading dock belonging to the factory that now covered half the block. But the workers knew where the boundaries once were. They said the concrete over the center strip never dried fully, no matter the weather. Some mornings they arrived to find their boot prints softened overnight, as if the floor itself had shifted while they slept. The night watchman, an ex-sailor named Martin Greeley, began recording the strange rhythms he heard during his rounds. Soft, percussive beats echoing from the sub-basement, always in the same sequence. 6 strikes, pause, 3. He compared them to ship engines, but the sound came even when every generator was off. His log entries grew frantic. Heard chanting again, male voice, low, Latin words I can't follow. Ground warm underfoot. Air thick as fog, though the windows open. Then the final line, dated March 14, 1925. He's moving closer to the stairs. Greeley disappeared that night, leaving his lantern still burning on the dock. The flame was blue. Police assumed accident or flight, but his coat hung neatly on its peg, keys untouched. The factory foreman ordered the basement sealed with new cement. It cracked within a week. That same year, a team of city engineers surveying sewer lines beneath the district reported a blocked passage under the Mulberry block. When they sent men to clear it, they found the obstruction wasn't debris, but a wall of fused brick resembling melted stone. Embedded within were fragments of metal and glass that glowed faintly when struck by light. One of the crew kept a piece as a curiosity. Later he complained of sleeplessness and a ringing in his chest. The sample was lost when his house burned. Months afterward. No cause was determined. In diocesan circles the name Brooke surfaced yet again, briefly and almost accidentally. A scholar preparing a lecture on ecclesiastical scandals cited him among unverified disappearances of clergy. The audience dismissed it as rumor until one listener, a visiting bishop from Boston, interjected quietly, That parish was closed for reasons we do not discuss. His remark silenced the room. Later he confided to the lecturer that old letters of William Henry O'Connell once mentioned a New York priest whose penance outlived him. The bishop refused to elaborate. As the decade advanced, only a few aging residents remembered the story. They spoke of it rarely, in tones reserved for prayer. One widower recalled seeing a faint light seep through cracks in the street after rainstorms, like candle glow beneath water. Another swore that on nights when the cathedral bells rang in mourning, a second toll answered from the ground. It was softer, slower, and always one beat late, as though echoing across time. City records show that between 1925 and 1927, 3 minor sinkholes appeared along that stretch of Mulberry, each forming in nearly the same spot, the line where St. Matthew's nave once stood. Maintenance crews filled them, but new depressions followed, smaller, circular, shaped like footprints turning inward. Workers joked it was the priest pacing below. Then one winter morning, a street cleaner found a brass crucifix lying atop fresh frost directly above the old altar's location. Its surface was warm, its edges damp, as though lifted from water. He turned it in at the precinct, where it disappeared into evidence storage and was never logged. The incident never reached the papers, yet among those who knew the street, a quiet phrase began circulating again, the same words etched into the buried arch discovered years earlier. Sub terra. Pax. Peace beneath the earth. By 1927, the district had changed its face once more. Factories rose higher, motor cars replaced the last of the horse carts, and the alley where St. Matthew's once stood became little more than a shadow between walls. The city called it progress. The few who remembered called it concealment. That autumn, a team of electricians was sent to replace faulty cables beneath the new warehouse that covered part of the old parish ground. The supervisor, Thomas Elridge, recorded that as soon as they broke through the lower layer of concrete, a rush of warm air escaped, dry, sweet, faintly perfumed with myrrh. He joked that they had struck a forgotten chapel. But one worker, peering into the opening with his torch, shouted and fell backward. Inside the exposed cavity stood a single object, a rusted iron lectern half sunk in ash. Beneath it, embedded in the soot, was a single footprint, human-sized, pressed deep, yet crisp, as if made that day. Elridge ordered the gap resealed, his report marked voided. None of the crew returned for the second shift. That winter, storms flooded the lower city. Drains overflowed, tunnels filled, and for several nights the street itself steamed like a kettle. Those who lived above the site said they heard bells ringing through the fog, the same pattern the legends always described, 6 chimes, a pause, 3. The sound carried through the metal pipes, making water glasses tremble on tables. When morning came, the air hung heavy with the smell of extinguished candles. The authorities blamed electrical faults. Yet in parish correspondence from early 1928, a final notation appeared beside the entry, St. Matthew's, defunct. All matters concluded, beneath his mercy. The handwriting was modern, but the ink oddly faded, as though written decades earlier. The factory endured a few more years before closing during the Depression. After its demolition, the land changed hands repeatedly, storage yard, parking lot, municipal depot, each venture failing within months. Workers claimed machines jammed for no reason, lights dimmed at the same hour each night, and ground moisture corroded everything left overnight. City inspectors eventually paved it over once more, leaving only an unmarked patch of asphalt. By then, no one alive remembered the priest by name, though the neighborhood still avoided walking that route after dark. A generation later, when the subway expansion reached Lower Manhattan, engineers tunneling beneath Mulberry reported an uncharted hollow. Their drills struck empty space, and from that space came the faintest vibration, steady, rhythmic, measured like breath. They filled it quickly, sealing the tunnel with reinforced concrete, and marked the segment inaccessible. Today, if one stands there in the small hours when the city quiets, the ground still gives a subtle tremor, as if something vast turns slowly below. Pigeons never roost on the street lamps. Rainwater never settles in puddles but sinks through unseen cracks. Locals say that when the cathedral bells ring at midnight, another tone answers, distant and low, threading through the pipes beneath the pavement. They call it the peace bell, though no one claims to know its origin. Some nights the air grows sweet with the scent of old incense, and a faint warmth rises from the stones. It lasts only moments, just long enough for passers-by to quicken their steps, muttering the old words without knowing why. Sub terra pax, peace beneath the earth. And then the city swallows the sound again, leaving only silence.